Hi, Jonathan Hetterly here, and today on Psych Cinema we're going to be discussing the psychological themes found in the recent film, The Miseducation of Cameron Post. Psych Cinema is Shrink Tank's video series where I explore the psychological themes found in the films that I watch and love. But before we get started, do me a favor. Subscribe to our channel and click on the notification bell. That way, you won't miss any time we drop new content that explores the intersection of psychology and pop culture. Now today I'm going to do three things. I'm going to give my overall impression of the film, and then I'm going to talk specifically about two psychological aspects about the miseducation of Cameron Post. One is we're just going to talk about sexual reorientation therapy, gay conversion therapy, reparative therapy. There's a lot of different terms that have been used in place of that. And then the second, I'm going to actually answer the question, well, what do you do in therapy if somebody comes to you and they are conflicted or distressed about their sexual identity or sexual orientation? But first, let's start with the overall synopsis of the film and my take on it. So The Miseducation of Cameron Post is actually based on a young adult novel about a young girl back in 1993 after caught in some type of physical sexual act with another girl is sent off to a Christian camp / treatment center that's basically focused on changing somebody's sexual orientation, identity, or urges. The focus that it is a conservative Christian center, and most of what you see is really non-evidence-based approaches to therapy, and it's really focusing on biblical precepts or scripture kind of quotes to help align somebody's overall mental well-being and how they should view sexual identity, sexual expression, sexual orientation, and what is morally right and what's morally wrong. And then through this, Cameron Post, played by Chloë Grace Moretz, she sort of encounters other young teens that are going through the same experience, and how it opens up some self-identity, some questions, and ultimately kind of a resolution through that experience itself. Now, personally, I found this film all over the place. And if there was one word I would describe this film, it's a mess. It's kind of a mess. I think it's well-intentioned, but I think that actually some of its source material maybe created some conflict in the overall tone and trajectory of this. I think first and foremost, not having read this, but I think this being adapted from a young adult novel wasn't super successful in translating it into film. This film is rated R, whereas a young adult novel, I'm assuming, was kind of glossed over in a lot of ways to make it more palatable and digestible for a young reader. And yet, they decided to kind of rough up the film in certain areas and sort of keep kind of that sort of soft approach in other areas. So this film isn't as biting as it could be. I also don't think it's as deep as it could have been. I essentially walked away from this film knowing a lot more about some ancillary characters than Cameron Post, the central character. And maybe she's designed to be the surrogate for the audience as they go through this experience. But my overall take on Cameron Post and her sexual orientation or sexual identity, the film basically begins with Cameron being confused and passive about it. And it really ends the film with her being kind of confused and not really sure about that. So she goes through very little character arc and development, even though she goes through this very horrific experience at this sort of reorientation treatment center itself. I don't think the film has a lot to say even about the conservative Christianity and the treatment itself. Now, maybe there's not a lot to say because we know that this has been banned and it's been proven to not be effective and helpful. And so maybe that's all that there needs to be said. But I did appreciate a lot of the secondary performances. Sasha Lane plays another girl there named Jane Fonda, of all names. And I think she really kind of highlights more of that tension of kids that did not volunteer or ask to go to this treatment center and how they're dealing with that. I also think there's a character played by John Gallagher Jr. He's been in Short Term 12, he's also was in 10 Cloverfield Lane, and I think he represents a conflicted, although well-intentioned and caring, reverend there that reports that his own sexual orientation was changed through this type of process. And in some ways, he has a genuine desire to help other people with their own suffering or wayward ways. But overall, I think the film is problematic because it really doesn't have a lot to say. But I think one of the biggest problems, quite honestly, is that the film is tackling sexual orientation, sexual identity, but it really makes a narrative or cinematic choice that I found very off-putting and disturbing. One of the criticisms leveled at folks that have a different sexual orientation or sexual identity is that critics of it or people that oppose it oftentimes make this faulty assumption that all they think about is sex and their urges. And in this film, for whatever reason, whenever it shows the Cameron Post character engaging with this girl that she is attracted to, or flashbacks while she's at the treatment center, it always centers around sexual activity and physical activity. And that really undermines this idea that somebody's sexual orientation or identity is only defined by their sexual acts. Versus, how do you develop friendship? How do you develop attraction, longing, feeling connected and loved by somebody else? And the film, I think, really makes a misfire in that. And I know that's not the intention of the film, so I've definitely found that very awkward, that all the flashbacks would be sort of created in sexual activity between two young teen girls, in some ways where it's almost like fetishizing it in a way that I found very disturbing and off-putting. So this isn't a film that I'm recommending, although I think it's well-intentioned, and I don't want to downplay young adult novels because I think there are a lot of books, young adult novels, that have been translated successfully into films. The first two that come to mind would be The Perks of Being a Wallflower, or even The Boy with the Striped Pajamas. Two books that really have young adult sort of writing and translates well to the screen, even when they're dealing with very sensitive and adult topics. But now let's kind of talk a little bit about this idea of gay conversion therapy and talk about sort of the implications, because in a lot of ways what you see in the film is probably what we tend to know and understand about the approach. It's not evidence-based. There's no research that says that it's effective. In some ways, it's basically behavioral modification with positive and negative reinforcements. And what we tend to know historically was it would be similar to where somebody that had homosexual sort of urges would be shown any type of image or scenery that involved same-sex or homosexual attraction, and basically in some ways there would be some type of negative reinforcement, like whether they would be shocked or whether they would be criticized or berated. And then they would show them something of a opposite sex attraction, a picture of a sexualized young woman or something of that nature. And there would be positive reinforcement so that they would, in a lot of ways, have these triggers of when they saw something heterosexual arousing, there was some type of positive messaging and reward, but when they saw something or stimulated by homosexual or same-sex attraction, there would be a negative reinforcement and, in some ways, pain. And we just kind of know that that doesn't work and it's not true. And so let's talk a little bit about the evolution of homosexuality and mental health / mental illness. So first published in 1968, the DSM-II, which is the American Classification of Mental Disorders, it listed homosexuality as a mental disorder. Now in 1973, so about 5 years later, the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, it asked all of its members attending its convention to vote on whether they believed homosexuality to be a mental disorder. 5,854 psychiatrists voted to remove homosexuality from the DSM, while 3,810 voted to retain it. And so the APA compromised. They removed homosexuality from the DSM, but replaced it in effect with what was known as sexual orientation disturbance for people in conflict with their sexual orientation. And it was not until 1987 did homosexuality completely fall out of the DSM, and it wasn't until 1992 that the World Health Organization removed homosexuality from its classification. And so while this film takes place in the early 90s, we are not too far removed from a society that has been taught that homosexuality was a mental illness. And in some ways, there is research that shows that those with different sexual orientation or identities, in fact, struggle with higher levels of mental illness. But the research tells us it's really because of the stigma and the social and familial rejection, as well as the stigma in our country and even the lack of representation in terms of legal rights, that oftentimes is what really stems from the higher rates of depression and substance abuse and trauma and even suicide. So we know this population does struggle with mental illness, but it's not because of their sexual orientation or identity. It in fact is how our society and how our families tend to stigmatize, judge them, and oftentimes reject them. So when we think about gay conversion therapy, the old adage, pray the gay away, oftentimes is a misrepresentation. It's really about punitive approaches. It's very didactic in a lot of ways, and it's a therapist, I'm using that word very loosely, it's usually some religious leader that is brainwashing them what to believe and how to understand their urges and what's going on. And you see that in the film where these young kids are just kind of talking about life and what they're understanding, and you see the main doctor at the facility tell them what that really means. That there's a lot of psychoanalysis and psychodynamic that usually brings it back in a lot of ways to blaming the parents, which was one of the earliest scapegoats of homosexuality, was that you didn't have loving enough parents. And in the film you sort of see like, my father and I bonded too much with competitive sports, and that's why I'm a lesbian, or that's why I'm more masculine in my approach. You see some of that within the film itself. And we know that gay conversion therapy has been banned, that it's been proven to not be effective, that it actually is harmful for folks. But then I think there is a sincere question to be asked, which is, well, what does a therapist do when somebody comes into therapy and they are distressed or confused about their sexual orientation or sexual identity? And an approach that has been validated by the mental and medical community is basically it's affirmative therapy, where it's really about supporting and validating and accepting. Now, the challenge here, and some people may disagree, this could be a controversial approach, but as a therapist, any medical and mental health professional, their duty is to do no harm. And in a lot of ways, it's really to attend to the mental, emotional, or physical threats, distress, or abuse. So that really means we need to take our own political and religious or moral beliefs out of the driver's seat and really help that person reconcile or come to terms with whatever that conflict or struggle is. Because in some ways, homosexuality, sexual orientation, sexual identity, it's a very polarizing and politicized topic. And a lot of people have this false belief that if somebody comes in, that a therapist's role is to just say, well, you know, you're gay, you're homosexual, celebrate it, accept it. And that's not necessarily the case, because we do know developmentally that a lot of people go through sexual identity confusion, to where they are trying to reconcile and really kind of grapple with those feelings and those urges and attractions that they go to. And there is ample research there that says that young people, this is very normalized. And so the role of a therapist isn't to, if a 14 or 15-year-old comes in and says, I'm struggling, I think I'm gay, I'm worried about it, to just say, you're gay, learn to accept it, embrace it. Our role is to really help them navigate things that are confusing or just stressing and bring some semblance of understanding, coping, and freedom from that. One of the approaches that one of the things I often say to clients that come in and they're confused about their sexual orientation, they're confused by a lot of things, is number one, it's like this only defines you as much or as little as you want it to. that you have full control in terms of whether they come out as gay, how much you want that to be the central part of your identity and how people view you, or how much it's just one of several things that are a part of who you are, but you don't want that to be the overriding dimension of who you are. And for some people that can be disarming or unsettling, that because in such a politicized environment that they assume that we just have to champion gay rights, which I think we can. I think we can, as well as say that it's not to my role is not to tell someone they're gay or that they're not. My role as a therapist is to care for them with non-judgment and help them navigate whatever the distress and confusion is going through. In a lot of ways, it's really about talking and unpacking what the distress is from. Is it fear of rejection from their family? Is it fear of rejection from their peers? Is it recognizing that our culture and society isn't as progressive as we'd like to think that it is, and that there's a lot of social upheaval and challenge that they're going to face? It's really about unpacking that and helping them understand both sides in terms of if there's confusion, rather than simply being didactic and dogmatic about it. Because first and foremost is you want to model to anyone that comes to therapy that you genuinely care about their overall well-being and their ability to function with what they're going through. Well, that's it for this episode of Psych Cinema. I hope you enjoyed it, but tell me, what did you think? What did you think about this film? Did you think that it was a better representation and more nuanced than me? Were there any psychological themes that I overlooked or just didn't address in this episode? Be sure to leave a comment below. You can also leave a recommendation if there is a film that you would like for me to unpack here on Psych Cinema. Be sure to follow me on Twitter, and also check out shrinktank.com, where you'll find other articles, videos, quizzes, and more that explore the intersection of pop culture and psychology. Thanks again for watching Psych Cinema. I'm Jonathan Hetterly, and we'll see you again next time.